Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. On this week's podcast, Roxanna Asgarian, former Imprint contributor and author of the new book, We Were Once a Family, joins to discuss her new work, which reveals the rich family history of the 6 children who were killed by their adoptive parents, Jen and Sarah Hart, 5 years ago this month. Before we get to that, let's do a few headlines. As we've discussed many times in this podcast, the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act is again up for discussion in the U.S. Supreme Court, this time via the Brackeen v. Holland case. You can go back to several podcasts from late 2022 if you want to get caught up on the Indian Child Welfare Act and also the Brackeen case. Few updates, though, on this front. First, as reported by our Nancy Marie Spears, a group of volunteers has met in California. They met earlier this month to launch the California ICWA Institute, which is a new think tank formed to advance legal and political strategies for protecting tribal sovereignty around the issues of family protection and child welfare. So among the aims of this new venture are developing statutes that preserve tribes' rights to participate in state child welfare proceedings, model legal briefs to support related litigation and policies, and then identifying strategies to increase funding for Indian children in state and tribal child welfare systems. So that's one. A couple other things on this front. Second is, as reported by our Faramina, Minnesota was already among the 11 states that have passed a state version of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which basically codifies most of the federal law protecting Native American families on the state level, but a bill is headed to Governor Tim Walz's desk in Minnesota that would actually enhance the state law with greater protections for Indigenous families that are in it. Namely, parents could withdraw prior voluntary surrender of their parental rights, and the network of who is considered to be a Native child's extended family is expanded under this law. And then finally, we have discussed a couple times the movement of more state ICWA bills in this last year as the Brackeen case is pending. The Supreme Court's already heard oral arguments. A decision's going to probably come down sometime around June. But a few states have started to move, towards having a state ICWA bill. There's about 11 states that have already done it. The first of those efforts from this session has produced a signed law, and that is in Wyoming, where Governor Mark Gordon signed into law a bill to codify the Indian Child Welfare Act there. And the value of these new state laws, or the existing, in some cases, long-running state laws that codify ICWA, the value of those is going to be determined to some extent by how the Supreme Court rules, if it does rule at all, that any or all parts of the federal Indian Child Welfare Act is unconstitutional. It'll really depend on how they decide that. The particular line of argument that was used by, anti-ICWA litigants in the case was around anti-commandeering, the idea of sort of federal law forcing states to enforce federal law on behalf of the federal government. That was a pretty crappy explanation. We've gone into more depth about that with Kate Ford on a previous episode of this podcast, if you want to go back and listen to it. But basically, in a state that has a state ICWA law, the commandeering is sort of taken off the table. So the thinking is that, to the extent that any findings of unconstitutionality or any parts of ICWA that get struck down on this anti-commandeering premise, it's the states with those state laws that will have the easiest time continuing to sort of manage an ICWA, court, ICWA process, the same as they did before anything changed on the Supreme Court level. So we mentioned Minnesota legislators moving a bill to Governor Tim Walz on the ICWA issue. At the same time, the governor was acting ahead of the legislature there on efforts to make Minnesota a refuge for transgender youth around the country. And what this means is in addition to permitting access to gender-affirming care for youth experiencing gender dysphoria inside of Minnesota. And gender-affirming care, refers to a plethora of things, including mental health services, the administration of puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and all the way to gender reassignment surgery, which is very rare, very rarely done on minors. Walz has instructed state agencies in Minnesota not to assist any other state investigating such services and care for the evidence of criminal liability or child abuse substantiation. So if a state comes knocking, asking for information, and, the sort of purpose or the origin of those questions is around possibly assessing criminal liability on a parent seeking transgender affirming care for a child, or a finding of child abuse, Governor Walz is instructing his state agencies to sort of stand down and not help or assist in any of those investigations. There's a big caveat in this executive order, which is the phrase, except as required by a court order. I'm not smart enough or a legal expert enough to know how many times a state would come looking for information in another state without the court order, so I guess that's kind of a gray area here. But Walz, in signing this order, said, in this state, hate has no home. In this state, love and acceptance is what we preach. 7 states have now banned gender-affirming care for minors, either through legislation that criminalizes it or actions by medical boards. Some of those moves are tied up in court actions. I know that Alabama and Arkansas have both passed laws to make these services a felony, are tied up in lawsuits. Texas went in another direction. We've talked about that on the podcast and many stories in the Imprint. They have categorized the medical services around gender-affirming care to be child abuse. Minnesota follows California into the trans refuge state status. California passed similar protections to what Walz has done in this executive order for youth traveling to California over the past summer. As I mentioned, the governor here in Minnesota got ahead of the legislature because there's a bill in the Minnesota House that would more permanently implant in law what Governor Walz is doing by executive order here. So we are, now fully engaged in this legislative season in a political and policy battle over whether gender care should exist at all for minors and if we should be jailing people for it, parents, or removing kids. And former President Trump, always so helpful on cultural issues, has said he'd ban gender-affirming care nationally for minors if he was reelected. Just want to point out that elsewhere in the world, the discussion starts from the premise of accepting the need for such gender-affirming care and has really moved more towards whether the right safeguards and protocols are in place to serve children who experience gender dysphoria. I'm going to include, just for people who are interested, a link to NPR's On Point podcast. And if you go to the March 9th episode from last week, you can hear a very nuanced conversation and news breakdown about the problems that led to one of the United Kingdom's gender clinics for youth getting closed down. And it's not a discussion about whether or not gender-affirming care should exist or be provided in the UK. It's just about a question about what are the lessons to be learned from the closure of a clinic that pretty much everybody by the end agreed was not doing their job in terms of moving youth along in a correct way with the right processes in mind as they dealt with gender dysphoria. All right, 2 weeks ago, we mentioned a significant proposed rule that had been put forth by the Biden administration around the issue of kinship care within the child welfare system. Just to recap very quickly, what this proposed rule was going to do is allow, every Title IV child welfare agency to adopt foster family home licensing or approval standards that look different for relatives and kin than their traditional format. And then, as part of that, also would allow those child welfare agencies to claim 4E funding, that's the federal money that goes out the door to support foster care, on behalf of, eligible children who were placed into a relative or kinship licensed home, even when the agency is using different standards for them. This is a big deal. And last week, in an op-ed published by the Imprint, a group of major leaders in child welfare announced that they plan to work together to develop a new suggested kinship-specific set of licensing approval standards, the idea being to help states think about, okay, what would a different path or what would a different, approach to licensing or approving kin look like? Just a quote from the op-ed, which I will link to in the show notes. This proposed rule is a golden opportunity to ensure that every child has the opportunity to be cared for by the people who know and love them with the same monthly support as all children with non-kin receive. It's a chance to align our practices with our values and a key step in becoming a true kin-first culture. Another quick hit on the Biden administration. The president put out a proposed 2024 budget last week without the usual appendices and deep dive details that are usually put out on the same day. So we're going to hold off on reporting much about the budget proposal until we actually see kind of the nitty gritty. We'll come back to that another day. But there is one top line new proposal that is worth calling out that the president put into his kind of main budget document. And that is the idea of, at the Housing and Urban Development Agency, putting together a $9 billion over 10-year housing voucher program that would support youth aging out of foster care. And again, not a ton of specifics here. The line in the budget is the budget provides $9 billion to establish a housing voucher program for all 20,000 youth aging out of foster care annually. And that number is not always 20,000. It can be above that. More recently, it's hit as low as 17,000. But, as an average, I'd say 20,000 is still pretty much right. So that would be a fairly striking ratcheting up from the current voucher system that was just only recently created during the Trump administration and called the FYI vouchers, or Fostering Youth to Independence. That's been about a $30 million as opposed to, $9 billion is a 10-year mark. So figure, $250 million a year or something like that. I'm not very good at math, but $30 million a year now is what we have in the FYI vouchers. And that supports a mix of vouchers that communities can compete for, part of it. And then some is set aside as like an on-demand voucher system that can be used for a foster youth who is exiting the system really anywhere in the country. And then when they're done with the voucher, kind of recycles back into the bin, so to speak, for HUD to use again in another foster youth case. So if for no other reason than this, it's interesting that somebody put a dollar sign on what the in aggregate cost might be for supporting housing for every youth who ages out without permanency. My guess is, when we see more detail, the plan will be for vouchers of like $1,200 to $1,300 monthly for a youth who exits care between 18 and 21 for 3 years. That was my back of the envelope math, says if you just did that for 10 years, that would get you to $9 billion. But like I said, we'll check our facts and check the details when they are made available, and we'll continue to report on all the new things that the president has proposed, both in child welfare and for juvenile justice, if there's anything. All right, last headline for this week, and this one comes from Eli Hager of ProPublica, reporting out of New Mexico about one of the problems with youth justice data that has stuck in my craw for a decade plus now. So go read Eli's piece, which I'm going to link to. It's not very long, but the gist of the story is this. New Mexico is about to pass a second look bill, which will provide a meaningful chance at parole for people in New Mexico who are serving, either a life sentence or a very long sentence for a crime they committed as a juvenile. I'll also link to Sylvia A. Harvey's excellent series for us about second look laws that we put up last month. And so ProPublica wanted to identify the people in prison right now in New Mexico that would stand to benefit with a new shot at parole. The only problem was New Mexico had no clue who those people were. Upon a records request from ProPublica, the state sent along a list of 13 names, but also followed it with, the note equivalent of a shrug emoji, conceding that the data problems and gaps that they had experienced over the years made it a very low confidence that this was, in fact, the full list. And they were correct, because ProPublica was independently able to establish a list of about 21, I think it was 21 people who are in prison right now for very long sentences related to crimes they committed when they were juveniles. So the practical impact for actual humans is obviously that when a law like this passes, like a second look law, it's of course harder to make sure everybody who might benefit is made aware of that if nobody is able to simply go in and figure that out. On the policy front, it speaks to one piece of a bigger blind spot in youth justice, which is what happens when a youth is transferred to adult court. Now, the average American, I am betting, if you ask them would say that what happens when a youth is transferred to adult court is that they go away to prison for a lot of years because they were sent to that court for murder or a violent sexual assault, the whole kind of concept of adult time for adult crimes. But one very local study in Maryland, must have been 15 years ago now, suggested that that was not the case. The majority of youth who were transferred into adult court were either waived back to juvenile courts by judges who looked at their case and said this is not appropriate for adult court. Some sat in jail and then were just released and never tried. Others were given probation. And then a very small percentage actually did go to adult prison and do a lot of time. So that was a very small study. During the Obama administration, in 2010, a study was commissioned through the appropriations process to assess exactly this question with what was going to be called the Survey of Juveniles Charged in Adult Criminal Courts. It was a very small grant, $500,000. It went to Westat, which is a contractor that does all kinds of research for the federal government and for others. And the short story is that that study never happened. We continued to ask the Department of Justice for updates on when it would be coming out. For years, there is a whole archive of columns that we wrote at the Imprint, or even before that when I was at Youth Today, about the, with just these comments from the Department of Justice saying, oh, it's coming, it should be right around the corner. And then in 2017, 7 years into the commissioning of this thing, I pretty much just gave up asking. So I have no idea if this will ever come out. It was a great idea. Somebody needed to do it. My understanding, just from people are somewhat familiar with it, is that it was what Eli surfaces here in New Mexico is a much bigger issue that many states have, and that there is just really no internal process by which most of them can track a person by age through the court and then eventually the prison system, especially when it comes to the adult prison system. So there was all kinds of problems, even trying to conceive of how the survey would happen or whether anybody would participate, because states don't really have to, So it's really a shame. I hope someday they figure out some way to track this, because it is a blind spot. We have no real idea what happens in the life of cases when juveniles who are accused of crime are switched to the adult criminal courts. All right, when we come back, our conversation with Roxanna Asgarian, author of We Were Once a Family.
Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making, and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child welfare.
We are joined today by author, reporter, Imprint alumna, Roxanna Asgarian, whose new book is out in stores on March 14th. If you're downloading this the day it comes out, you've got 2 days to prepare yourself and then go buy it on March 14th. It's called We Were Once a Family, a story of love, death, and child removal in America. Roxanna, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Many people, probably many of our listeners, became familiar with Jennifer and Sarah Hart, a couple that intentionally drove off a California cliff, killing themselves and their 6 adopted children, Sierra, Abigail, Jeremiah, Devante, Hannah, and Marcus. Roxanna's book, We Were Once Family, is an account of the families, the very complicated families that both of these sets of siblings had in their lives before they were adopted and sent to live in another state, far away from anybody who knew them. Her work, at the very least, raises questions about the process through which all that happened, and I definitely want to get into some specific points along the way that jumped out to me in reading this. But first, maybe Roxanna, talk about how you came to know about the death of these children and about the families they came from and started reporting on it.
Yeah. So I was a freelance journalist living in Houston when the crash happened. And this was almost exactly 5 years ago. So end of March 2018. The Oregonian, which is the Portland daily newspaper, was reporting about the crash because the family had lived in that area at the end of their lives. So I got a breaking news assignment because they got a tip on one of the birth families. So there's 6 kids from 2 separate family groups. And one of the families lived in Houston. And so I came to know the story through that lens immediately, just by virtue of that assignment. When I got the assignment, I had done a couple stories about the child welfare system in Texas. And so I sort of had that framework or that lens as I was talking to them. And their story was just super, beyond tragic. They were experiencing extreme grief. They had just found out like a couple days before that. And they heard from their lawyer who kind of figured it out when she saw it on the news. So they were really confused. They didn't know what was going on. No like official person had called them to tell them about it. And it just struck me that this was like clearly a child welfare story. But beyond these little breaking news things, mostly just my stories for the Oregonian, there was like nothing about the birth families, either one of them. So it kind of became like a true crime sensation. And the story has been told a lot through that lens, through the lens of the adoptive mothers and their, psychological motivations or their experiences in parenting. And I felt like that wasn't the lens that was interesting to me. So that's sort of how I got into it.
And it certainly, however you feel about that part of it, it certainly wasn't the entire story. And it was the only story being told. It was really from the framework of like, how did these parents snap? What caused them to do this thing? It couldn't have been, it had to have been a momentary, almost like this comes out of the book a little bit. Everybody quickly, including law enforcement in this investigation of it, into really coalescing around this was an instantaneous or a momentary lapse into craziness. It's not the word I use, but I'm losing. Yeah. I'm fumbling for the right word for what it was. I was heartened to see kind of in prepping, by the way, that at least, to the extent that Wikipedia is the official record of all things, they classify it as a mass murder now.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I haven't checked the Wikipedia in a while, but I should. I was for a while checking it a lot because it was interesting to see like where the...
Yeah. I went to look up like somebody's name and just noticed that they call it a murder, which they did not do that right after the story.
Yeah.
Just a dorky journalist media question, but I'm curious, like, kind of skipping ahead to the end of you having had this experience and doing this, but how did you deal with, to some extent, kind of becoming a character in your own work? That's obviously a no-go and just straight up news reporting, but my sense is like, having read this book, there's like no world where you could have done it without having some connectedness beyond being just a scribe.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, it's kind of a no-no in most works of journalism. I would argue even narrative nonfiction books because, journalists are supposed to have that bit of remove or detachment to be able to tell the story. So that was it was a hard question that it took me a long time to kind of come around to in the writing was, the main thing was that there were parts of the story that I definitely influenced. Like, for instance, as I mentioned, there's 2 separate family groups. I found the second birth family and I told them what happened. And that was 6 months after the crash and no one had told them. So they didn't know. So I felt like, and they were devastated, obviously, but also they were like, what? It was a huge news story and like no one found them, no one told them. So I felt that was like a very important piece of the story because, for me, it was very affecting in the moment to see sort of the lack of humanity or, dignity for the birth families just as victims of this heinous crime. It was like they were erased from the record. And so they were just not considered as, and they very much consider those kids their kids. And, they grieved them when they lost them the first time, but they had a narrative in their mind that they were okay, and they weren't okay. So it was a really, I wanted to draw attention to that piece of it. And I felt like, how could I do that? If I was like disappeared myself from that part of the story.
And it's like, I almost feel like when I say there's no world where you couldn't have been a character, I think it's because of the things you're describing that sort of forced you to be. I mean, it's kind of an important piece of the story that, like, there's these two sets of kids, two sibling sets of three. One would not have found out, except that they had a lawyer who was involved with them that found out. And then the other literally would not have found out had you not told them.
Yeah.
So, like, it's not like you're asking to be the bearer,
No.
media responder of the news, but like, what can you do? And then there's another, I don't want to give away a lot of this book, but there's another thing that happens with these birth parents towards the later. It probably wouldn't have happened if you hadn't intervened.
Yeah, I think that it's okay to talk about that. That's the kids. Part of the thing was it became clear during my reporting that I was connected to all of the families of both the women and also the kids, the birth families of the kids, but they weren't connected to each other. And so that was a really kind of weird position to be in, because I felt like I was explaining to the other families, like, about the other people, but they wanted to be at a remove from each other. And I think part of that was the grief hit everybody differently, and for the women's parents, I think there was a shame aspect to it, and a blame, like, as you do as a parent, right? Like, what did I do for my kid to do this to other people's kids? Like, so other main piece that I was involved in, I felt like I needed to be in the book, was Jen's dad had the remains of, basically, I orchestrated getting some of the remains of the children back to the birth families, which was something that they immediately expressed to me in our first interviews.
Both of them independently.
Both of them independently, yeah. They were like, where are the kids now? And like, can I have them? And that was like, because they had no rights to their children, that was like the next of kin was the parents of the women, the Hart women. So that was really weird because they were estranged from their parents already. So the parents had this kind of huge responsibility too in this, plus the blame and all of that. So, yeah, so it was it was quite a heavy process.
We're recording this in early March. I was actually down in Georgia for some work stuff, and I was mostly reading this for the second time in public. And I had a few people, ask, what's this book about, that they saw on the table, which of course there's like a literal answer to. Oh, this is about the parents and families that loved 6 different children before they were murdered by the people who adopted them. It's kind of a literal answer. I gave a more ethereal answer that I actually am like, kind of wish I hadn't. And I'll tell you what I think the sort of through line is, but I'm curious for yours first, or I can go first if you want. But I'm curious, like, if you just had the answer, what is this book about? What's the through line of your book? What would you say it is?
Well, like you said, there's sort of that, like, here's what it's about. But thinking about it so much for so long, I really felt that it was kind of a meditation on grief and, of course, on family, like, and the ways that family, isn't enough. And then the ways that it is just still, that the bonds are still there, like, however fragile or broken or, estranged or any of that. Like, it felt very clear that all of these people still had so much love, and within that love, so much grief.
So here's what I have been thinking is a kind of a through line between what happened with these kids early in their lives and later, as far as the child welfare aspect of it all, right? The system. To me, it's about how in child welfare, particularly the foster care part, we can overreact to the presence of drug use and underreact in the absence of it. So a situation that maybe looks complicated because of the presence of drug use, in particular by a parent, but has fixable elements and people there to support, somehow it's not good enough. But then you have in the hearts this family that there were some pretty significant red flags over and over again that come up. But because drug use is not one of them, I can't say this for sure. I can say anything for sure. I really feel like that plays into it. Now, you might be listening to this and say, well, like, bigger picture, there's this big conversation around how does poverty get confused with system stuff. And I totally agree with that. I think that there's work to be done in figuring that out and how we ameliorate poverty as a way to prevent reporting before you even get to child welfare involvement. But when you look back on like the experience in the United States about foster care, the surges in foster care very clearly track with like surges in drug use. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I don't think that that's, I think I kind of felt that throughout the storyline here too, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are ways that, like in particular, the Davis family, Sherry Davis is the birth mother and she has a drug addiction. And I think there's like ways that families can be either legible or illegible to the system. For instance, Sherry had a partner who was not the biological dad of the kids, but the kids had lived with him since their birth. He was a sober, stable father figure who cared about them immensely. But it was like, that's not legible. So, their relationship was unusual, like, because she was having other partners. And they were like, who is this guy? And just kind of disregarded him off top. Like,
And also his sister, who is also has no involvement in drug use, was willing and actually was a caretaker.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, she was the aunt, paternal aunt, and she took all four of the kids. So three of them got adopted, but there was four, and Dante was the oldest, and he actually got left in foster care for most of his childhood. And then he ended up back with Nathaniel, the father figure. So that's really interesting too, because, Nathaniel never gave up. And so it's like, again, with like the legibility, it's like, I think that Jen, specifically Jennifer Hart, was very aware of that, of performing that good parent that caseworkers like to see. Talking about like being trauma informed, right? And my African American children experience racism. She was big on Facebook, so she put a lot of this stuff out there. I think that her style of parenting was legible to the caseworkers when Nathaniel wasn't, and Priscilla, the aunt, she was a totally upstanding person. She just was struggling under the weight of 4 additional kids in her home. It's really interesting because the Texas Ledge is actually looking at, in 2023, finally making kinship payments equal to foster care payments. And that's, at the time that this story took place, was even worse than it is currently, which is like they still get a monthly payment. It's just not the same amount. But back then you got $1,000 one-time fee for the first kid, $500, for each additional kid. And that was it. And then you got like a stipend for clothes and things like that. Imagine your family growing by 4 children, at once. Diapers, groceries, school uniforms, whatever. So it's interesting because it's like there were a lot of restrictions. There was no benefit of the doubt.
And I guess why I come back to the drug use as a significant part here is that all those things aside, they were down to have her care for those kids for the
Yeah.
long haul until she let Sherry stay there, right? So, I almost get it, maybe from a closer look, you know that some people disagree. It really didn't seem like anybody in the family felt like Sherry was in a position or ready at that time to be a full-time mom and like present caregiver.
No.
But like they were so afraid of her drug use just being adjacent to these kids,
Right.
they couldn't see a path to these two people who had no history of drug use and had
Right.
nothing but a track record of caring for the kids to work it out between Priscilla and Nathaniel,
Right. That's true.
Yeah, that really kind of blew me away. Let's talk. I want to stay on Priscilla because, of course, the greatest pain reflected in this book comes from the loss of the children and the news of that hitting birth families. But there were two really painful moments that I thought kind of spoke to something bigger that I wanted your thoughts on. And both involve meetings where people are blindsided. Priscilla is the first one. She finds out at a CPS office that she thinks she's going to just to see the kids, that it would actually be the last time she would ever see those kids. And I think she even says, I wish you had told me that after. It wasn't, on my face and in my heart when it
Right.
happened. And that really just was a moment where you can put yourself in that position. I think everybody's been, called to, shown up to something thinking one thing and found out something going the other direction. It just
Yeah. And she had, appealed the decision, and she was hoping to get the kids back. She like admitted that she made a mistake, that she wouldn't do it again. So she showed up to what she thought was a visitation, and it was a goodbye. Yeah, and they told her like right before she saw the kids.
like it's so brutal. And I think that the bigger thing it speaks to is this, and you write about this in the book, the CPS view, not everywhere, but in some places, that kinship dies with the parents' rights being terminated. In other words, kin are a factor in terms of prioritization of where kids should go until you terminate the rights of a parent, at which point it's as if none of them ever existed.
Yes, I agree. And I think that it sort of highlights how the way that we think about these things is not the truth of a family connection. Like your family connection, just when the piece of paper is signed that says you are no longer this person's parent, that doesn't mean that your experience as a parent goes away. Like I'm a parent. I can't even imagine thinking that I would ever not be a parent. Like that's such a part of my identity. And like that relationship is basically like the closest, most loving relationship that I've ever had. And I think that's how a lot of parents feel. And you don't have to be nobody's a perfect parent, but you can have your issues, you can have your personal problems, and you still have your identity as a parent. And I feel like when that gets severed, it can be so crushing, like so like foundation shaking. I think that both birth mothers in this story lost other kids. Sherry lost kids before these 4 kids. And Tammy lost kids after the ones that she lost. It was like, and she said it, she was like, it made it so I couldn't bond with my child because I knew that there was this fear that something could happen, and I could experience that pain again.
And it's really two issues. I mean, there's the issue that I think has come more front and center in the discussions around child welfare and policy, which is the speed at which we move to terminate the rights of parents and the parents' ability to stay in the game, so to speak, to ever get their kids back or be in some way involved. And then
Right.
there's the other thing, which is what we were talking about with Priscilla, which is let's assume for a minute that the termination is proper. Does that actually mean that nobody connected to that child and their parent have a claim, a right to be the caregiver again? I thought of it immediately made me think of a series we did in Minnesota about a grandmother who was just trying to adopt her grandson and had the same thing basically happen. I had a judge from California who just knows a lot about kind of reasonable efforts and stuff like that, wonky stuff, review the case. And, he this is not his words, so I won't even mention who it is, but he basically was like, she was lucky she was in the game at all. I mean, there's places in this country where her claim would have ended at the termination of her son's rights.
Yeah.
Which just kind of feels there needs to be a separate conversation about that.
Yeah, and also it's like we're doing things to other people that we would never think is okay for people that we, our families. We have this idea of like, good parent, bad parent, and it's like so black and white, and it ends up with like really inhumane decision making. I feel like that's really clear in the Davis family's case.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
So the other person who just gets an anvil dropped on their head at a meeting is Bree, who is an adolescent who is living with the Harts in Minnesota before any of this happens, before they ever adopt any of these children.
Yes.
Who shows up to her therapist appointment. Now, as you relay in the book, it's not like everything was like totally perfect at home. And you should please read this book because there's just like so many moments that are just so compelling. And the Packers incident, I'm not going to go any teaser, the Packers incident, but she shows up to a therapist appointment and is told, I could, it's just like, you can imagine the appointment probably starts with a therapist going, how are things going? How, like normal questions. And it's like, so bad news, you're not going back to your home. You're going to you're just being uprooted and moved.
Yeah, right now.
You thought like nothing is, at the end of this meeting.
Yeah, like you're all packed actually.
Your stuff is outside.
Yeah.
Surprise.
And you're never seeing them again.
Yeah.
No goodbye or anything.
And then it comes out after the fact because this girl is just sitting there with no explanation of why that happened to her. None.
No.
Later, it comes out that the Harts had told people that in the system that she had a rope and she was suicidal, which is all BS. And that's so that is, I guess this one doesn't travel outside like the kinship termination thing, but like within this story and within this case, the fact that that was obviously not true.
Yeah.
And all of the way that it went down really seems in hindsight to the first of many points at which somebody should have stood up and said, like, we need to go into these people's house and like really investigate.
Yeah.
It's never,
and
right?
And that was it. Not really. No, I mean, they had several CPS investigations in the places that they lived, but the one in Oregon, they had like a doctor look at the kids, and all but one kid was so small that they weren't even on the growth charts for their ages, like not on the chart. And they said, well, we don't know, like, what their birth families, were like. So maybe it's like they came from two separate birth families. Like, what are the odds there? It felt like it really mental gymnastics were happening a lot when it came to, and again, there was this sort of weaponization by Jennifer and Sarah of the kids' trauma and their problems being in foster care. Like that was the go-to reasoning for anything that they were getting investigated for. So like their food issues was why they're so small, when it's like they were clearly being malnourished, underfed.
And it just feels like there's an appropriate, concern about the over surveillance involved in child welfare and over reporting and doing too much of the reporting I think this part of the story kind of speaks to, like, I don't know, there is a value in, especially when you can piece together concerns voiced from, like, all these different people that have, like, nothing to do with each other, right? A teen
Hmm.
who was in their home,
Right.
a person that lived next door, another
Teachers.
person in another place that lived next,
Yeah.
a teacher and doctors giving you
Right.
medical data about birth weights and stuff like.
Right. I mean, what else would you really need? And, the other thing is the difference between abuse, like, it felt like, well, first of all, I had this in my head, because we say most of the child welfare cases are neglect only and not abuse. And so that's sort of a framework, right? But like the hearts were being investigated for neglect because like malnourishment issues is a neglect issue, which I could see like a situation in which it would be, right? Like if you were in poverty and had trouble getting food on the table. But this was not that. This was abuse. Like this was clearly abuse, like withholding of food. That's so it was interesting. It was like even the lens that they were looking through. Whereas Sherry, who tested positive at the birth of her child, like that's physical abuse. That was like a physical abuse investigation. And so just interesting because it's like there was no distinction made for like intentional harm.
Yeah, like even just saying, like, maybe like the solution is just that we need to start calling, like, would it be easier to just categorize willful neglect, intentional neglect as abuse? Would that simplify this to sort of figure out what the right
Yeah,
thing is to do in response to reports?
To me, it seems very like that distinction seems so vitally important. If you're withholding things that kids need, that's intentional harm, that's abuse. So like I struggled with that when I was trying to, because I think it's important to mention that like the vast majority of cases are neglect things that aren't intentional harm, right? But like it is a little more gray. There's more nuance there, I think.
Yeah. And I guess with the hearts, it's like any one of those you could see putting into that category. One person one time saw something and reported it and was concerned, but that was just over and over again with them
Yeah.
on different levels.
Yeah.
And I come back to, you know, maybe it just seems like, I mean, maybe one of them was struggling with their drinking. I can't remember exactly the details, but on the surface they presented as people who just did not have drugs. And I really
yeah,
wondered that as I was reading it, like if one of these two women had tested positive for like meth
yeah.
plus these factors, would things have come out differently?
I mean, God, yeah. That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I think there was clear mental health stuff, but it
Yeah.
was maybe a little more difficult kind of mental health stuff than like I can't get out of bed with depression, and that feels like you can see that more clearly. Like this, I think was a little more. I mean, because part of it was again there was a persona and a sort of mask, a masking that seemed to be working on
Yeah,
officials over and over again.
for sure. So this is actually the second time that you've been on the podcast. The first time was you came on to talk with me about a story you'd worked on with us about the culture of silence around investigating abuse and neglect claims for kids that are in foster care, which seemed
Mm.
kind of relevant a little bit to this book because the kids were adopted, but also I think more from the experience of Dante, who we haven't really talked about much. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that and like his experience with foster care and residential care there.
Yeah, I think there were so many aspects of this story that I felt like pointed out different problems in the child welfare system because they lived in different states, for instance, and because the racial element was quite obvious. But the other piece was Dante, because I feel like Dante's experience as a long-term foster youth is so his experience and experiences of kids in that position are very under known and reported. I think it's these kids are sort of intentionally isolated. It feels that way. So Dante He was the oldest of the 4 kids, and his younger brother was Devonte. So that's the one that most people know because he was in that viral photo hugging a cop at a protest. So Dante was 8 when CPS first removed him from home. And so he was 10 when he was split from his siblings. And he was acting out because he didn't want to leave his family, and he didn't want a new family. And so he ended up in a residential treatment center for like several years. And during that time, when you mentioned the like anvils dropped, I thought this was going to be one of them actually, because he was the oldest sibling. And so he felt a lot of responsibility for his younger siblings and continually asked. So I had his foster care file, which was like narratives from every single time a caseworker would talk, they would go and type up a couple of paragraphs. So like every single time he was asking, where are my siblings? Can I see my brothers? Can we have a home visit? Can we, like, on and on and on. It was so heartbreaking. And the last time he was supposed to see his siblings before they moved to Minnesota because they were getting adopted, no one had told him any of that. He didn't know they were getting adopted. He didn't know they were moving out of state. He showed up to the meeting, the visitation. The foster parents that they were currently living with just didn't bring him. So he just sat there by himself. And then he found out way later that he was never going to see them again. And they were like, sorry, but it was so, so awful. Such a terrible way of, it's like they left him in the dark about his own life and his own family. And that really, really...
I think it felt different to me reading his experience versus like Priscilla and Breeze, because for them, it was like this one moment anvil type thing, where I just feel like it was constantly coming at him like that in a different, I don't know, I guess you're right, that particular meeting in particular, you're right.
Well, but it wasn't for him. It was like he still didn't get it. And they had his therapist break the news to him. And so he doesn't trust therapy, I mean, gosh, he won't even go to the doctor. He won't even take his disability benefits. He basically told them, I don't want it. Because he thinks all of that is like CPS. And he just thinks CPS is evil.
Have all of the people who are central to this book read it, and what have you heard from them about it?
No, they have not. So Dante is incarcerated again. So by the time the book was finished, ready for reading, he's kind of hard. He's been hard to reach because he moved around. Nathaniel passed away last fall. I gave a copy to his daughter, from his first marriage, who I met at his funeral service, and that was really cool to give that to her. She read it and she gave me some thoughts, and that was really, I was really glad to get. And then Tammy, who is the other birth mom of Marcus and Hannah and Abigail, we talk all the time, but she's in a domestic violence situation with her long-term partner. And so there's issues with, essentially we just figured out how to get her a e-copy that she can read on her tablet when it comes out, just so that the physical copy...
So it's not sitting around.
Yes, exactly. Because he's in the book under a pseudonym. I thought it was also important to her story that I talk about how she's living now. But yeah, so it's a little bit more challenging than just sending a copy and that kind of thing.
Well, for all of you listening out there, you can get a copy on March 14th, which is soon or has already passed, depending on when you heard this. So go out and get it. We Were Once a Family, a story of love, death, and child removal in America. Roxanna Asgarian, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks to Roxanna Asgarian, author of We Were Once a Family, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes The Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voice program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would support our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theimprintnews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always reach us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.